girl living deep in the snowy woods saves a man on the brink of freezing to death. Unaware he's a betrayed billionaire. A silver compass, a broken promise, and a return amid melting ice will change everything. But will love arrive in time? The wind howled through ancient pines, whipping up swirling flurries of snow that blanketed the ground. The sky hadn't fully darkened, but the pale light of the winter afternoon barely illuminated more than a few steps ahead. Claire Bennett hunched her shoulders, pulling the collar of her tattered coat higher. She wasn't used to venturing this far, but the cabin's firewood stack had been empty since morning. If she didn't gather something tonight Mrs. Helen would tremble again from the cold. Claire's hand gripped the icy handle of the axe, each step trudging through knee-deep snow. The wind shrieked in her ears like a vague warning. She was about to turn back when she heard it, a faint sound, almost swallowed by the storm. A groan, or perhaps she imagined it. Claire froze, scanning her surroundings. "Anyone there?" she called, her voice hoarse and trembling. No answer. But then the sound came again, clearer this time, weak, desperate. A groan like that of someone on the brink of death. She ran toward the sound, feeling she had nothing left to lose, and then she saw it. A dark figure, half buried in the snow, motionless. Claire dropped to her knees, digging through the icy layers. A man, his face pale, eyebrows frosted white, lips blue. His designer coat was torn, stained with blood pooling around his leg. The smell of blood, cold and metallic, mingled with the damp wood of the forest. "Can you hear me?" Claire shook his shoulder. No response. "Hey!" She slapped his cheek lightly. His lips twitched faintly. A raspy whisper escaped. "Help me." She didn't ask his name, didn't need to know who he was. Claire slung his arm over her shoulder, bending to hoist him up. His weight nearly crushed her, but she braced herself, dragging him step by step toward the path leading to the cabin. The wind grew fiercer. Snow lashed her face, stinging like razors, but Claire didn't stop. One step, then another. She gritted her teeth, cold sweat soaking her back. In her palm, she felt his skin, ice cold. The cabin door swung open and Claire nearly collapsed onto the wooden floor. Mrs. Helen rushed over, alarmed. "Good heavens, what have you done?" Claire didn't answer. She only whispered, "I couldn't leave him." And as the first flames began to thaw the ice on the stranger's skin, Claire Bennett didn't know she had just saved Ethan Blackwell, or that she had set in motion a journey neither of them could have foreseen. Night fell over Alaska like a heavy, dark shroud. The wind no longer howled as fiercely as it had during the day, but the air inside the cabin remained strangely cold. Ethan Blackwell lay motionless on the wooden chair by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, the firelight casting shadows on his still gaunt face. He had been awake for a few days, long enough to speak, to feel the weight of his body again. But tonight, it wasn't the pain in his leg keeping him from sleep. It was something else. A faint echo in his dreams, a tattered image amid white snow, a memory on the verge of returning. Cold sweat beaded at the nape of his neck. Beneath his tightly shut eyelids, fragmented images flashed. The clink of glasses, the warm glow of a fireplace, familiar low laughter, then the smell of liquor, a wave of dizziness, a howling wind, and the sound of a door slamming shut. Ethan jolted upright, gasping, his heart pounding chaotically. His breath formed thin wisps in the cold air. Outside, the wind picked up again, but inside the atmosphere grew thick and heavy. He closed his eyes, chasing each shard of memory like a man groping in the dark, and then a name burst into his mind, sharp as a knife slicing through flesh. Derek Simmons, his trusted assistant, the one who knew every detail of his schedule, the one who had stood there in the lavish lodge in Fairbanks pouring him a glass of brandy by the fireplace. "To your success, boss," Derek had said. "Tomorrow, the gold mine is officially yours." And then, a bitter taste, a staggering dizziness. Ethan remembered swaying, the glass slipping from his hand, and Derek's eyes, not panicked, not surprised, just silently watching him collapse, silently, as if it had all been planned. Ethan clenched his fists, knuckles whitening, sweat glistened at his temples. A chill crawled down his spine, not from the snow, but from the sting of betrayal. In the darkness, soft footsteps echoed from the kitchen, Claire likely up to add more wood to the fire. Ethan didn't turn. He didn't want her to see him like this, not out of weakness, but because what he had just remembered demanded silence. A silence like a dagger, plunged deep into his chest, impossible to pull free. He faced the fireplace, the crackling flames illuminating the darkening edge of his gaze. Ethan Blackwell had awakened from his coma only to fall into another nightmare. Betrayed by the one person he had trusted most. "There's something I think I need to tell you," Ethan Blackwell began, his fingers tapping lightly on the rim of a wooden mug. The firelight from the hearth cast shadows on his cheekbones, making his face oddly serious. And for Claire Bennett, seriousness was the first sign of trouble. She didn't respond, just sat quietly, her hands carefully peeling the steaming skin of a roasted potato. She was too used to silences that forced others to clarify themselves. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'm not exactly the random drifter lost in the snow you might think I am." "Oh?" Claire raised an eyebrow, not looking up. "The truth is, I'm Ethan Blackwell." He paused. "I own Blackwell Enterprises. You probably haven't heard of it." Claire took a bite of the potato, chewing slowly. "Probably not. I don't follow financial news much," he faltered. Her response wasn't what he'd expected. "It's one of the largest private conglomerates in the country. Investments, real estate development, finance, technology. Sounds busy." Claire blew gently on the hot potato, her gaze still fixed on the food in her hands. Ethan blinked. "I didn't want to hide it from you. It's just, at first, I didn't remember who I was, and after I did, I thought, you thought if I knew you were a billionaire, I'd act differently?" Claire cut in, her voice sharp like a thin blade slicing through early spring ice. She looked up. Her amber eyes were deep and calm. Ethan swallowed hard. "Not exactly, but I thought. The truth should be clear." Claire leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "So what's the truth, Ethan Blackwell? That you have a private jet, that the watch you wore could feed my entire village for 3 months? Or that you've never lit a fire in your life?" Silence. Ethan didn't argue, not because he had nothing to say, but because she was right. Claire exhaled, her gaze softening. "I saved a man dying in the snow, not because I knew he was rich or poor, but because he was human. Back then, you were someone who needed help, and I helped." She stood tossing the potato peel into the fire. "Out there, you might be somebody. But here, amid snow, forest, and survival, you're just a guy who can't tell dry wood from wet and nearly died trusting the wrong person." She turned, pausing at the door. Her voice softened, slow and laced with both wry mockery and raw truth. "Don't worry, Blackwell. I don't care for you because of your money, and I won't pity you for it either." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Ethan, for the first time in his life, feeling that his name didn't matter as much as he thought. The snow fell gently that morning, as if the sky itself didn't want to weigh things down further. No wind, no biting cold, just a quiet stillness blanketing the pines, the wooden roof, and the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Ethan Blackwell stood by the cabin's doorstep, bundled in a thick coat, his backpack ready. In the distance, the sled dog pawed the ground impatiently. Everything was set for the journey. Everything, except one thing. Claire Bennett stood across from him, silent. Her eyes were calm, but there was something fragile in them, like a lake frozen early in the season. beautiful still, but a single touch could shatter it. "I'll come back," Ethan said, his voice low and earnest. "When things in New York are settled. When I can prove to you I'm not like what you've seen of that world." Claire nodded slightly, as if she'd heard those words from others at different times. "You believe me, don't you?" he pressed, almost a whisper. "Just wait." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small object, an old silver compass, its edges scratched, the glass clouded with age. She held it out, her hand still gripping it, not fully offering it yet. "Do you know what this is?" Claire asked, her voice soft, like a story being told. Ethan shook his head. "It was my grandfather's," she said. "He was the only one in our family who ever left this place, and the only one who found his way back." She opened the lid. The compass needle trembled in the breeze but held steady, pointing true. He said, "A compass doesn't just guide you to a place. It leads you home, if you're brave enough to follow." Ethan was silent. He looked at the compass, then at her. Those eyes weren't hard, weren't cold. They were simply used to not trusting words alone. Claire closed the lid and gently placed the compass in his hand. "Take it. If what you say is true, it'll help you find your way back." She turned, her voice carrying softly as she passed him. "Don't make promises. Promises are the easiest thing to say when someone's about to leave." The cabin door closed behind her. Not forcefully, not final, just enough to keep out the wind and to hold back an unnamed expectation at the threshold. Ethan looked down at his palm. The silver compass lay there, heavier than any promise he'd ever made. And for the first time he understood. Coming back didn't just take words. It took a path, and someone worth returning to. The phone vibrated for the 37th time in 3 days. The same name flashed on the screen. Ethan Blackwell, Claire Bennett. Didn't touch it. Not out of anger, not to punish anyone. She just didn't know why she should answer. Outside the window, snow began to fall again. Not fierce, not wild. Just thin flakes like ash, blanketing a landscape already too familiar. The cabin was as quiet as ever, but today that quiet wasn't warm anymore. It was hollow. It sounded like a heartbeat in a chest no one answered. Mrs. Helen sat at the table, mending a shirt, saying nothing. But Claire knew she saw everything. She saw every ring, every time Claire silently turned away. She saw the way Claire's eyes dimmed whenever the phone's light flickered in the dark. On the other side of the world, in an apartment too luxurious to be called a home, Ethan stared at his screen. The call had gone to voicemail the 13th time that day. He didn't know what else to say into it anymore. Maybe all his words had become noise when someone didn't want to hear. "Claire," he said, voice rough, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope you'll listen to me once." The message sent, then vanished into the void. Ethan leaned his head against the glass wall, where the city's lights stretched out like a river of stars, the world he'd once ruled, now colder than an Alaskan night. The silver compass still sat in his coat pocket, so familiar he sometimes forgot it had once been Claire's. Its needle always pointed north, but to him it pointed only one way, back to her. In Alaska, Claire set her tea down on the table, sighing. Each time the wind whistled through the door's cracks, she wondered if he might be standing on the other side, waiting like she was. But she didn't pick up, because she was afraid that hearing his voice would make her forget why she'd learned not to trust pretty words. She stood, gazing out at the endless white beyond. Some longings didn't need names, and some people you loved weren't meant to be held onto but let go when they chose a world without you in it. On the other end of the line, Ethan said nothing more. He just sat there, phone on the table, hand clutching the ice-cold compass. No signal, no response. Only one thing remained. One person calling endlessly, and one who wouldn't answer. The ballroom's lights poured down like artificial sunlight. Thunderous applause echoed. Cameras flashed relentlessly. A billion-dollar deal had just been signed. Ethan Blackwell smiled reflexively. The spotlight caught every angle of his face, every expression honed over years of practice, but behind his gray eyes, his gaze was emptier than ever. This was the moment any businessman would dream of, the pinnacle, the glory, the triumph. Except Ethan felt nothing. As the crowd dispersed, champagne still shimmering in his glass, he stood alone by the 60th floor window, gazing at the city below, an ocean of light with no end. Beautiful, dazzling, and cold as metal. Jonathan, his new assistant, spoke from behind. "You just did what no one else dared, Ethan. You rebuilt from ashes. You should be proud." Ethan didn't turn. He stared at the horizon where the city's glow swallowed the stars. "There are some things," he said slowly, "that once lost, rebuilding doesn't mean anything." Jonathan fell silent, then retreated, leaving Ethan in the glass room, his reflection staring back from every angle. A successful man, a perfect image, an icon, but that image was now just a shell. In his inner pocket, the silver compass remained. Old, scratched, but unbroken. He pulled it out, cradling it in his palm. The needle still pointed north. Still true, still loyal, unlike the man holding it. He'd chosen to return. He'd said he'd fix things, that he'd go back to Claire. But the days swept up in financial races, meetings, headlines, and events. They'd turned his promise into a faint echo in a soundproof room. Claire hadn't sent a single message, didn't answer his calls, didn't reply, as if she'd never existed in this world. And what terrified him most was that this world kept spinning smoothly without her. But he couldn't. Ethan stared at the tiny needle trembling in his hand. It wasn't just a compass, it was conscience, it was memory. It was a reminder that somewhere on the map there was someone who didn't need him as a CEO, didn't need him as an icon, just needed him as a man. One who could keep his word. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it away, and for the first time in months, amid the most dazzling lights, he saw the truth clearly. He was standing between two worlds, and he belonged to neither. The internal memo landed in the encrypted inbox. No one noticed. No one suspected. But Ethan Blackwell was different. Subject line, confidential clause addendum to Goldstream contract, URG. Sender, Jonathan Reed. Attachments, a revised contract and hidden audio file buried deep in the metadata. Ethan opened it. The recording was just over 3 minutes, poor quality, but the voice was unmistakable. "Don't worry," Jonathan's faint laugh crackled through. "Once Ethan signs off, all mining rights transfer to the new investment group. He won't read the fine print, and if he catches on, it'll be too late. He's too busy daydreaming about that girl in Alaska." Silence, then another voice. "You sure? If he digs deeper, we've paved the way. New board, new shareholders, pressed busy hyping the comeback. No one cares about the original deal. Ethan Blackwell's just a figurehead." Ethan's face turned to ice. His hand gripped the mouse. No trembling, no panic, just a cold jolt from the base of his neck down his spine. Betrayal, for the second time. And this time, not from an enemy. From the man he'd handed power to clear the path for a fresh start. Ethan stood. He pulled the silver compass from the drawer. Silent, the needle pointed north, unwavering. He'd lost his way once, trusted the wrong person once. Not this time. There was no time to waste. He called his legal advisor. "I want an emergency shareholder meeting and a freeze on all Goldstream transactions." "But you just announced the restructuring. Halting now will cause a shock wave." Ethan cut in, his voice cold, resolute. "Good. Let it shake things up." He hung up, sending a single text to Jonathan. "Don't leave New York. We need to talk." Then he turned back to the contract on the screen. The added clauses, cunningly tucked into appendices, traps woven in words. Ethan hit print, the pages spilling onto the desk like indictments. He was no longer the man lost in the snow. No longer the CEO, letting others pull the strings. No longer the man caught between two worlds. Now, he was the man choosing his path. And the first choice was to stand, for honor, for truth, and for a woman who taught him that a promise only held value with action behind it. He fastened his coat, eyes locked on his reflection in the glass. Blackwell, he said to himself, it's time to go back. Winter in Alaska had no concept of ending. It only shed its skin, trading one layer of snow for another, pouring down silences, thicker, deeper. Claire Bennett stood alone by the frozen stream, where she often set rabbit traps in the early morning. The stream was now just a flat white mirror, reflecting a leaden gray sky. No sun, no movement. In her hand was the silver compass. Its needle trembled faintly, like breath in the wind, pointing north, or toward something else harder to name, a longing without a voice. Ethan had been gone for nearly 2 months. No letters, no calls, not a single sign. And Claire, the most stubborn soul who needed no one, trusted no one, found herself coming here each day, to this spot in the snow, in the cold, as if waiting. She didn't say it, didn't admit it. It was just passing by, just checking the traps, just happening to carry the compass. But anyone among the pines knew nothing in this world was coincidental, only things we didn't dare face. A raven's cry pierced the air from bare branches. The wind skimmed the icy lake like an old blade. Claire gripped the compass tighter, its metal cold as if reminding her that steel didn't wait for anyone. Only people waited for each other. Mrs. Helen had said, "He's not coming back, dear." Claire hadn't answered, because she knew if she spoke, she'd have to choose between hope and pride, and both, for her, were luxuries too costly in this life. Then, that afternoon, the wind shifted. Claire trudged back to the cabin, her steps sinking deep into the snow, leaving blurred tracks, like her presence in someone's heart. The wooden cabin stood alone in the frost-covered valley, a testament to her. Small, solitary, but unyielding. No need for promises, no need for witnesses. Existence was enough. Claire stoked the fire, setting the compass on the wooden table, beside a cup of tea she never finished. From inside the cabin, her shadow stretched long across the wall, so long it almost looked like someone stood beside her. But no, it was still just her. Still this room, and a woman learning to wait, without naming what she waited for. A quiet sigh. Another spark flared in the fire, and the compass lay there, like a symbol with no promised return. That morning the wind howled less fiercely than usual. Snow fell lightly, like white whispers brushing the cabin's roof before melting away. Claire Bennett was stoking the fire when she heard the dogs barking outside. Not the frantic yips of danger, but short, sharp sounds signaling a stranger's approach. Strange, because who would visit such a remote place in the harsh grip of winter? She threw on her coat, pulling the hood over half her face, and stepped outside. The man standing by the sled was unfamiliar, but in his hand was something that stopped Claire's heart, a letter, sealed tight, ink slightly smudged by the cold, and in the bottom corner, in handwriting she couldn't mistake even at a glance, Ethan Blackwell. "For you," the messenger said, his voice low and steady. "He told me not to say anything more, just to deliver it to your hands." Claire reached out. Her fingers trembled faintly, not from the cold, but from the tremor rising within her. She didn't open it right away. She waited until the man left, waited until the silence returned, waited until her heart stopped pounding as if it might break free. Only then did she carefully slide her fingernail along the seal. "Claire, I lost my way once, and then you gave me a compass, not to show the path, but to test my heart. I understand that now, and I chose to go to the very end, to see if I was truly worthy of coming back. I've walked through a forest of people, of ambition, of empty promises, and crowds pretending to care. But nowhere did I find eyes as honest as yours. Nowhere held a silence as truthful as your cabin in the snow. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing to tell you I'm back, not to New York, but to myself, because of you. Next week, if you still have that compass, if you remember what I once said, come to the place where we parted, the lone pine by the stream where the snow melts first. If you don't come, I'll understand. If you do, we can start again, from the place we never should have missed. Ethan Claire folded the letter slowly. Her hands still shook, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something fragile and beautiful. Hope. She glanced at the silver compass on the bookshelf. Its needle pointed north, as always, but now it seemed to point to something else. A quiet, delicate but sincere promise. And for the first time in months, Claire smiled. She wasn't sure if she'd go, but her heart, it had already started walking. The snow had begun to melt when Claire Bennett crossed the stream's edge. The ice cracked into small, transparent shards, like glass, reflecting the gentle glow of a sky hinting at spring's arrival. At the foot of the lone pine, where she had once turned away without looking back, a figure now stood waiting. No words, no movement, just a presence steady and humble, like a promise written in breath and silence. Ethan Blackwell turned when he heard the snow crunch under her boots. Seeing her, he didn't step forward, didn't rush. He only nodded, as if the entire world condensed into that moment. Claire stopped a few steps away, her hand tightening around the silver compass in her pocket. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Ethan said, his voice low and calm like water flowing beneath melting ice. "I wasn't either until this morning," Claire replied, her gaze drifting to the forest behind him, where dreams had once been buried and where new ones might begin. Ethan stepped closer, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. Not a contract, not a love letter, a blueprint. "A community health clinic," he said, "located at the town's main crossroads, near the hunting grounds, the school, and the place you once called home." Claire unfolded the paper. The lines were simple but clear, hand-drawn. The faint traces of pencil showed. "Nights spent thinking it through. A foundation in your name, not for gratitude, but to remember that you saved someone unworthy and made him want to become worthy." A breeze swept through. Claire closed her eyes briefly. In that moment, she saw it all again. The broken promises, the nights she waited in vain, but also the first snowy morning, the clumsy meal he cooked, his calloused hands, and the look in his eyes, no longer a CEO's but a man's, who had learned to love truly. She looked up. "I don't need a clinic. I don't need blueprints. I don't need promises." Ethan froze. But before he could step back, Claire continued, "I need someone who'll stay, not for the world, but for me." He didn't answer with words. He simply held out his hand, slow, steady, not pleading, not expecting, just an invitation to walk forward together. Claire placed her hand in his. It was the same hand that had once held power, then let it go, and learned to hold the one thing money couldn't buy, love. A month later, the clinic opened. No flashy signs, no reporters, no speeches, just townsfolk coming for medicine, checkups, and a young couple standing side by side, as if they'd never been apart. The silver compass was placed in a glass frame, hung in the main hall. Below it, an inscription read, "Some paths aren't on maps, they're in the heart." Some stories leave us speechless, not because of their luxury, but because of how people find each other through pain and hope. Thank you for being with Millionaire and Heart Stories. See you again on the next journey that touches the heart.